Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 19th of August. Today we're going to be doing a full frontline update, beginning with the situation around Robotyne. In this area, you have the 1st and 3rd Linear Battalions of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade that have been sent to fight within Robotyne itself. They've been able to expand Ukraine's control within the village itself. Beforehand, Ukraine only had control over some of the northernmost houses and basically just the outskirts of the village. Now they've been able to push deeper, advancing through a cemetery, advancing through some of the blocks that enter the center of the village. The center of the village is still a gray zone with the Russians still occupying the southern part of the village, but the Ukrainians are sending more and more forces into the village and they're increasing the intensity of their attacks. Their attacks are coming in from two main vectors. One is directly from the north, where you have these two hedgerows that the Ukrainians have constantly been using as sort of this concealment for their infantry as they try to enter the outskirts from the north. And then you have the other vector of attack from the northeast, you could say, from these afforestations. These afforestations are now fully under Ukrainian control. There's two main forest patches that I'm referring to, them circling, that the Ukrainians are using as a forward position, not just to attack into Robotyne, but also to advance through the fields on the eastern flank of Robotyne, over here, for instance. And so the Ukrainian forces in this area, they have been able to set up forward positions, and then from there they enter the northeastern outskirts of Robotyne. And we have seen them over the past few days been able to make sizable gains, but this comes at a cost, of course. The Ukrainian forces that are entering into these houses are being shelled very heavily by the Russians. This is just one example, this video over here, of Ukrainian positions being shelled in Robotyne. This also does indicate that the Ukrainians do have at least control in this area, which is why I was able to adjust the map. But of course, a lot of this is temporary because you have small groups that are being sent in with vehicles. A lot of them are forced to withdraw due to the heavy shelling back to their original positions. This includes infantry. But for the most part, the Ukrainians do still have positions over here, although they do have to make rotations. I'm not saying brigade rotations, but like a rotation of a squad. Like a squad will go in and conduct some sort of combat operation, and then due to some sort of casualty, and it doesn't even have to be that high, but just due to the nature of the fighting, they do have to do pretty regular rotations of squads and groups of forces on a very small scale in these villages. But regardless, the Ukrainians do still have a foothold, and I do see what's going on over here as very similar to what occurred in Urozhaine and Stormayorsk over the past few weeks, where the heaviest fighting occurred on the outskirts. That's where we saw the real battles go on, because the Russians in all three examples have very fortified positions on the northern outskirts of those villages. And that's where the Ukrainians sort of hit a wall, where for a while they couldn't advance, they couldn't enter. Once they do enter, at that point, you also have the Ukrainians sending in these new reinforcements and launching artillery strikes onto the Russian positions within these villages. And at some point, it becomes very difficult to defend these villages as they're on the front line, ground zero contact line. They just become extremely difficult. The houses get damaged. It's hard to send forces in a large quantity to these areas without them being shelled. And so eventually, it just becomes untenable to defend those areas, and the Russians opt to withdraw to better fortified positions to the south, closer to their main defensive line. But this also we also obviously have to give credit to the Ukrainians for pushing through, sending in their forces, and being able to defeat the Russians in these battles. But so far, the Russians have not withdrawn. We'll have to see if over the next few days, if Ukraine increases the intensity of their assaults into the center of the village, then perhaps we'll see a Russian withdrawal. And at the same time, the Ukrainians, they're also congregating a lot of forces in Balka-Uspennivska. Balka-Uspennivska, which is a nature reserve in this area, it's turned into a major stronghold for the 82nd Brigade, which has a newly formed unit that has been moved to the front line to begin attacks around the Robotyne axis. A lot of the forces of the 82nd Brigade are congregating around this nature reserve before they get sent to various missions. Maybe it would be in Robotyne, maybe it'd be on the eastern flank or some other village, I don't know. And this makes them a target because they're all congregating in some of these trenches, some of these forces patches. And that's when you have Russian Air Force, they notice this and they begin hitting these Ukrainian positions. And that has also yielded some casualties. Russian sources are claiming that there were some very heavy strikes on the nature reserve, and they claim that they were able to destroy one Starlink terminal. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a Starlink terminal in this area, because you do need to have communication between all these different groups that are isolated as they go on and attack what could be considered uncharted territory because of the fact that those were previously Russian positions. And so that's just part of the war where you have the Russians airstriking. I have a geolocated video over here. I'll click on it over here. You can see the Russian airstrike on Ukrainian infantry. The Ukrainians, they were marching in I think it was a dozen forces, a dozen troops towards the contact line, and they set up positions in a trench. And once they all enter the trench, that's when the Russians launched the airstrike, and that would increase the lethality of such a strike. And so that's just sort of a microcosm of what's going on over here over the past few hours with these Russian constant strikes. Now let's move on to the situation around Urozhaine. Now around Urozhaine, we're not seeing any significant Ukrainian attacks yet, because the Ukrainians are still trying to regroup and recuperate from the latest round of fighting around Urozhaine. So for now, the attacks the Ukrainians are launching are on a very small scale. Nothing significant towards like Stormlanivka, or nothing significant even towards Javitne Bajnaya. For now, the Ukrainian assaults in this area are really being conducted by the 36th Marine Brigade, and specifically by the 1st Marine Battalion of that brigade. So just as an example of what they're doing, they're trying to clear out the outskirts, the southern outskirts of Urozhaine. So generally in this area, I'll try to circle it for you guys so you can see which area I'm referring to. In this area, you have some hedgerows, you have some dugouts that the Russians are still occupying in certain cases. So this Marine Battalion, it was sent to to ground zero of the front line with small groups, and those small groups are going to dugout from dugout to each one, and they're just clearing them out. And there's video footage that I have here geolocating this. So here you can see 4 Russian infantrymen, they had to retreat due to this Ukrainian assault. And this is the geolocation. They retreated past this one forested area, but the video cut out before we could see where they were going. So maybe they actually did enter this area, or maybe they withdrew further south. Either way, you can see generally what the Ukrainians are trying to do. They're trying to clear out the southern outskirts of Urozhaine, so they'll have an open pathway to use this road that starts in Urozhaine and then runs all the way into the northern part of Stormlanivka. But that will be an operation that Ukraine does in the future once they fully recuperate their forces. For now, most of the fighting is really just artillery duels. You have artillery duels between the Russian artillery, of course, and then the Ukrainian 55th Artillery Brigade and the 1st Tank Brigade's artillery group. So that's just most of the fighting in that area. Now let's move on to the situation around Kupyansk. Now before I go on to what's going on around Kupyansk, I do want to mention that we now have confirmation that the 43rd Mechanized Brigade is stationed generally around the Russian Zherbets bridgehead. This is due to the fact that we have a geolocated video of an FPV from the 43rd Mechanized Brigade that hit a Russian truck around the road leading into Kovalivka. And if you zoom out, this is around the bridgehead, which we talked about extensively when the Ukrainians, or the Russians, crossed over the Zherbets River in this area over here. And this indicates that a unit that was previously in reserve, the 43rd Brigade, has now been moved to the Luhansk front to try to hold the line and potentially counterattack. And now, I don't know where the Ukrainians had this brigade slated to go. Maybe it was somewhere else. But this does indicate that the Ukrainians take this threat seriously on the Luhansk front, and that it's being diverted away from a different part of the front line, which could have potentially been Zaporozhye, because this unit was previously in reserve and not seen any sort of combat. But now let's move on to the Kupyansk front. Around the Kupyansk front, we are receiving, again, further reports from the Russian side of attacks east of the town of Simkivka, on the field to the east of it. Russian sources claim to have captured 2 more strongholds. Now, I don't know what a stronghold even means anymore, because it seems like there's so many around this front. I've already talked about like 25 strongholds that have been captured, or observation posts that have been captured. I think that when Russian sources talk about strongholds, they're just referring to like a firing position of the Ukrainians. Like maybe that area had some sort of Ukrainian group that was stationed in a forested area, or was stationed in some sort of tree line. I don't know, something like that. And then they were just firing from that position, and that's what's considered a strong point. In that case, it is very plausible that stuff like this happen on a daily basis, because you are seeing the Russian is advancing through these fields. And so if a strong point is justifying points for a few Ukrainian soldiers, then that would make sense. And that does definitely happen on a daily basis. At the same time, the Ukrainians from the 67th Mechanized Brigade, which is one of the units which was diverted from, I'm not actually sure where it was before, it might have been a reserve, but it was diverted to the Kupyansk front very recently to deal with the Russian advances. The 67th Mechanized Brigade was sent to conduct a counterattack south of Vilshana, but so far they've been unable to change line. But what these counterattacks by the Ukrainians do is that for at least a certain amount of time, they pause the Russian advances as the Russians are focused on trying to defend the gains that they already have made in this area. And so that's really it in terms of Kupyansk. Just last thing is that the 14th Mechanized Brigade, which is another unit in this area, I would say it's like the vanguard for the Ukrainian forces. It's been at the front line for so long, and they've not really been given much support up until now. Now they're getting support due to the Russian gains. But now the 14th Mechanized Brigade, they're also sending their reinforcements to the contact line to hold the line for as long as possible, as the Ukrainians try to fortify Petropavlivka and Kupyansk suburbs more generally. Now let's move on to the situation around the Black Sea. So on the night of August 17th, and this happened around, I would say, 11 p.m. on August 17th, obviously in Ukrainian time, the Russians reported that there was an attempted Ukrainian unmanned surface vessel attack on Russian patrol ships, specifically the patrol ships Pitlivi and Vasily Bykov. And the Russians claim that these USVs, and they didn't give a specific number of how many were sent by the Ukrainians, that these USVs were destroyed by Russian onboard armaments from these patrol vessels. And so there was no damage incurred by those two boats. That's what they're saying. There's no footage that could prove either side. And so for now, we don't know for sure. But the reason why this is so interesting is because, first of all, this happened about 237 kilometers to the southwest of Sevastopol. So it is pretty far away from really any sort of land. It is pretty far away from the Ukrainian coast. Not as far as other targets that were hit by Ukrainian USVs, but still, again, very far away. Which, again, begs the question, where are these USVs coming from? Are they really coming in from the Ukrainian coast? Are they coming in from vessels that are sailing along the Ukrainian coast, and then they go and get released and hit Russian targets? That's something that's still up for debate. But regardless, the thing that's interesting, the most interesting thing about this is that the Ukrainian attempted hits on these patrol boats happened at around the same time as a Hong Kong container ship, so civilian vessel, called the Joseph Schulte, departed from the port of Odessa. So port of Odessa is over here. And this is very interesting because this is, again, a civilian vessel that's being transported post-grain deal. So there is obviously a threat of it being targeted by the Russian Black Sea fleet. And so let's just talk about the route that it took, because the reason why it's so significant is because the route that's been taken by this civilian vessel could basically be used as a blueprint for every single other vessel that the Ukrainians want to enter and exit from their ports and from their territorial waters in the future in a way that would be protected by NATO and by the Ukrainians, that would prevent the Russians from targeting those vessels. So the Hong Kong vessel, it came out of Odessa. During the time that it was in Ukrainian territorial waters, it was protected by two small Ukrainian naval boats, and it was also protected by 3 Ukrainian Bayraktar UAVs, and it was also protected by the Ukrainian Air Force, specifically by 3 MiG-29s and 1 Su-27. But Ukraine wasn't the only nation to protect this vessel, as it made its way through Romanian and Bulgarian territorial waters, because it decided to stay specifically in these areas because that would decrease the likelihood of a Russian attack, because it would be in a NATO country, foreign country in general's territorial waters. During that time, the vessel was protected by an American Boeing P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol and reconnaissance aircraft, and that was flying, I believe, over here above Romanian airspace, and also by an American MQ-9A Reaper UAV, which probably was around here, around the Black Sea. You have a lot of these American UAVs flying around the Black Sea, usually in international waters. But either way, that was to provide protection for it and to monitor the Russian Black Sea Fleet at the same time. And the vessel was able to cross through the Bosphorus Strait at the end, and it has been able to arrive at its destination. Destination is this port over here. I'll show it to you guys. It's very close to Istanbul, the port of Ambarli in the Sea of Marmara. So the reason why I'm even mentioning this is, again, because it's just a microcosm of what could be now adopted as a strategy for civilian ships, and maybe just for ships in general, that the Ukrainians use to enter and exit from Ukrainian ports without being targeted by the Russians. And again, this happened at the same time, reportedly, because this, again, is a statement from the Russian side about this USV strike. But apparently it happened around the same time as a Ukrainian USV attacked Russian patrol ships. So that was probably a way to, if it's true at least, to distract the Russian Black Sea Fleet from taking notice of that specific vessel that was making its way to the Bosphorus Strait. And again, there's many reasons why the Russians want to prevent these vessels from leaving Ukrainian ports and entering Ukrainian ports. Some of it is obviously economical and political. Some of it's also the fear that Ukraine is using these vessels to launch these drones to attack the Black Sea Fleet and other targets. And so that's also, on the flip side, a reason why Ukraine wants to continue having access to the outside world for those economic and political reasons. And then also, this is again up for debate. I can't say for sure for either side. Perhaps because the Ukrainians may be using these civilian vessels as a way to, target the Russian Black Sea Fleet without them noticing. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.